Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event here at the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. My name's Julian Hutler. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, whether you've joined us online, wherever you happen to be in the world, or you're here in this lovely Sibylla room. For anyone who doesn't know, this room is named after one of the first nuns we know about back in the 1150s. Now, we haven't had conversations quite here since the 1150s, but the college has been a place where people have thought about many, many challenging ideas over a huge number of centuries, as a nunnery, then as a college. Now, the Intellectual Forum is much more recent than that. We haven't been thinking about these things for long, but over the last years since we were set up in 2016, we've tried to get people to think and talk about a huge range of interesting and important things. Our speaker tonight, Professor Sarah Colvin, has been instrumental in many of those things, including the establishment of the Intellectual Forum itself. We've worked with her on a number of events and some wonderful people, including authors who are written up here, wrote the books that are up here. The idea of protest is also one that we've looked at on a number of occasions. In fact, just last week, we had what I at least thought was an amazing event with the Moscow Times looking at artists against the Kremlin and some of the actions that artists in Russia and outside Russia have been taking to show their concerns. And that was amazing. Like many, many of the events that we do, it is available online as well if you'd like to watch that. And the book is really amazing. But tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome Sarah, not to talk about other people's books, but to talk about her own book, her own work, and the impact that it can have. What can resistant fiction do in an age of post-truth? And her book has the wonderful name, I'm afraid I didn't memorise it, Literature and Epistemic Injustice, Power and Resistance in a Contemporary Novel. We'll be hearing about that and a range of other contemporary novels. Sarah is the Schroeder Professor of German, a really wonderful person, and our speaker tonight. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes, great. So not to disappoint you, but actually I'm not mainly going to talk about my book tonight. I'm mainly going to talk about these books, but I'll come on to that. They're probably more fun. So thank you ever so much for coming, and thank you for the people online for coming too. It's really lovely to see so many interesting people here. Is there anyone here who actually went to the event last week, which was a fantastic event on protest art, apart from Julian? Okay, it was wonderful. I recommend you watch it online, The Artist Against the Kremlin. It was kind of powerful and moving. Does anyone here belong to a book group? Great, welcome. I'm really happy you're here. Since 2023, I've been part of this European project. So there are 6 universities across Europe. Zagreb is the lead university, then Poznan and Berlin, Cambridge, Brighton and Nicosia. And one of the things that the Cambridge team has been working on is resources for book groups. The other thing it's given me a chance to think about is something that's been on my mind for a lot of years, which is kind of to do with my object of study. I'm in the humanities. What does art actually do? You know, what happens? Beyond being something that is, nice and relaxing for the evenings and at weekends, and I'm absolutely not saying it shouldn't be that. If reading helps you to be happy and relaxed, then that's brilliant and important. But if that is all art does, then it's a real mystery why the Kremlin is currently censoring artworks and putting artists in prison. And it's a mystery why books are being banned all over the world right now. In really large numbers. So PEN International, the International Writers Association, is noting a dramatic increase in the number of book bans around the world and in the persecution of authors. So about a month ago, second week of October, was Banned Books Week. I don't know if anybody was aware of the things that were going on then. But certainly the banning of books is one of the signs of authoritarianism. Writers lose their freedom to write. Why? So the question I'm wondering about is, what does art do that authoritarians seem to be afraid of? And I've been exploring for the last few years the idea that art, in the form particularly of novels, which is the thing I understand best, offers something that is probably essentially anti-authoritarian. And that thing that is essentially anti-authoritarian, I think, has to do with movement. And quite often, when we've been listening to music or writing or looking at pictures, we say that art makes us feel moved. Art does seem to create movement in us, which can be emotional movement, so movement in our bodies, but also cognitive movement, I think movement in our minds. And we know authoritarian governments restrict bodies from moving, so Berlin walls get built and people's passports get taken away, and curfews are imposed and people are put in internment camps, so prevention of physical movement. But we also know that authoritarian governments stop the free movement of ideas, when academic and scientific freedom are suppressed, and when books are banned, when teaching curricula are restricted, and when learning is controlled. So these people are afraid of movement. This is the president of International PEN on World Book Day, which was back in April this year. Censoring books is not just silencing authors, it's an attempt to suppress society's ability to question and to reflect. Authoritarian governments fear the transformative power of words, words that challenge injustice, expose truths, and inspire change. At PEN International, we believe that books are powerful forces capable of reshaping dominant narratives and resisting oppression. So that's a really interesting statement. If novels, I'm sticking with novels, are capable of reshaping dominant narratives and resisting oppression, how exactly would they do that? What are the mechanisms? And those are the questions that were driving me when I wrote my new book, which I'm not going to talk about very much. But I was interested not so much in the stories about resistance that get told in novels as the way writers tell those stories. What are the techniques? What are the mechanisms that they're using to tell the stories? What are the voices that we hear? What are the time frames that the stories operate in? How do the novels use humour? What bodies, what kinds of bodies do they show us? What's the formal arrangement of those bodies? Anybody who's known me for a while knows that I'm a bit obsessed with the literary form of chiasmus, which is that kind of A, B, B, A, where there's like a mirror down the middle and it reflects. And I find it fascinating when that arrangement seems to suggest a mobile connectedness that acknowledges difference at the same time as connecting us. And it almost feels as if the art, the novel, is suggesting a way, a shape in which society might operate a bit more effectively and a bit more justly than it does at the moment. So that's what I mean when I say, formal arrangement, those shapes that come into novels and communicate something. And also, the final thing I looked at, because all these novels, the novels I was talking about are recent, I'm interested in the question how, as fiction, they address the contemporary problem of lies and political post-truth. So I am absolutely not here to persuade you to buy my novel. It will, as of next week when it's published, if you buy the hardback, it's absurdly expensive and I would strongly advise against it. I hope my publisher's not watching. But the electronic version will be free, it's open access, so I don't need to persuade you to buy it. What I would much more interested in doing is persuading you to read these books, which are the 8 books I wrote about, which actually made my life very much worth living for quite a long time. Julian was talking about connection with the college. Quite a lot of them are connected. So Preeti Taneja, who wrote We the Too Young, has spoken at the Intellectual Forum, was a member of this college. Sharon Dodwell-Otto, who wrote Ada's Ram, has spoken at the Intellectual Forum, was our writer in residence at the Modern Languages faculty for a while. We haven't had the others yet, but I hope we will. It would be great to have them all. I'll work on it. None of these novels are currently banned or censored. All of them play in authoritarian or oppressive political contexts. I'm going to talk about them without giving any spoilers, because as I said, I'm hoping you might want to read one of them. Has anybody already read any of these? Raise your hand if you've read one. Yay, very good, thank you. The contexts they play in. So Mo Yan's Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out. So the Chinese writer Nobel Prize winner Mo Yan plays in post-revolutionary China. So we're in China of the Cultural Revolution. Boris Lovgrad plays in Ukraine in the 2000s. So not in the contemporary Ukraine of the war, but before that, post-Soviet under the oligarchs. So Ukraine in the rise of the oligarchy. We Need New Names and Glory, the two No Violet Bulawayo novels, both play in versions of Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe's government. We That Are Young plays in India just before it was published in 2017. Modi was elected in 2014. So it was written just in the build-up to the election of the Modi government. So the kind of rise of Hindu nationalism is the context. Lincoln in the Bardo, George Saunders takes us back in time, way back to 1862. So we're in the United States during the Civil War, 3 years before the abolition of slavery. Ada's Realm plays in different times and contexts. So we have 15th century West Africa, and what's happening is that the first European sailors are just starting to come up the coast. 19th century colonial London, a concentration camp in Germany in 1945. So we've got here the heyday of colonialism in London, we've got German fascism, and then the final time and place it plays is Berlin now, and London also now. So places where the legacies of colonialism and fascism are still affecting people's lives. So the last 5.5 centuries are somehow still active, having effects. A Thousand Coils of Fear, the last one, plays in contemporary Berlin again. And the background, again, there's a kind of dual time frame going on. We've got the background of, I'd say, sort of historical racism in East Germany under socialism, but then we've got contemporary racism in the unified Federal Republic now. But again, the present and the past are very clearly not separate. And the story is told by a young queer Black German woman who's trying to work out whether being a fairly well-off Black Central European makes you an oppressor or whether it makes you oppressed. So I'd say all of those are resistant fiction, but then I would say that it might well be in the nature of all literary writing, and I'm happy to talk about later what I mean by that phrase, literary writing, to be resistant. To check on that thesis, I went online and I just, idly looked up a few of those lists that people post of the best novels ever. And obviously it depends who you ask. And the weirdest list I found was The Guardian's. Very strange indeed. But there were a few novels that kept appearing on the lists. And here they are. So 1984, it plays in an overtly authoritarian context. To Kill a Mockingbird in the context of racial injustice, Things Fall Apart in the context of colonialism, Pride and Prejudice in the context of male entitlement, class privilege, and Beloved in the context of racism and slavery. And all of the novels, as you'll know if you've read any of them, engage critically with those contexts, and all of them invite readers to engage critically with those contexts. So interestingly, the novels that regular people putting up lists on the internet list as the best novels ever are resistant fiction. And that suggests that we like reading fiction that pushes us to notice difficult things about the world. That kind of intellectual, emotional movement, when we notice things that we maybe hadn't noticed before, seems to be pleasurable. It makes us want to list that novel as one of the best ever. And often novels make us listen to voices that we don't normally listen to. So anyone read Curious Incident of the Dog? Yes. So told by Christopher Boone, autistic little boy. Bet lots of people have read this. Orlando. So we've got queer voices, neurodivergent voices, telling the stories in these very well-known kind of, I'd say sort of by now, kind of canonical novels. And another sign of authoritarianism is the suppression of exactly those kinds of voices. So interesting that those what novels bring us. Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo is set in a graveyard. and told by ghost voices. Among other things, the ghost voices bring us face to face with one of the big unmentionables in contemporary capitalism, which is that people die, and no amount of shopping is going to change that. But also authoritarians are very afraid of death, specifically of their own deaths, and I'll come back to that. No Violet Bulawayo, We Need New Names, is told in the voice of a child called Darling. Darling lives in a shanty town in Zimbabwe, later in the United States, in a town that she calls Destroyed Michigan. Guess what that is, yes? Question, what does it do in a novel for adults when a child tells the story? This is the moment where I'm going to check whether participatory lectures make you uncomfortable. If you'd like to answer that question, whenever you'd like to hazard an answer, you don't have to. If participatory lectures are uncomfortable, we won't do one. What does it do when a child tells the story in a book that is actually written for adults? Yes, please. It gives a more innocent perspective on the story, so I'm aware we don't have the mic circulating. Yeah, so the response that gives more innocent, exactly. The more innocent perspective being the one maybe that isn't socialised in the way that adults are. So children see things that I've learned not to see, that I've been taught not to see, and children question things that adults learn to see as normal, and I managed to work Calvin and Hobbes into almost everything. But that child perspective, it upsets the apple cart of the everyday stories that we tell ourselves. It upsets the narratives and the beliefs that we've learned to live by. If you think about, for example, Huckleberry Finn, so another story told in a child's voice. And poor old Huck keeps hearing the voices of the grown-ups in his head, which are telling him that, you know, helping his friend Jim to escape from slavery is actually a really bad thing to do because it's a crime against Jim's owner. And Huck knows that his own sense that at some level it's the right thing to do actually carries no weight in society outside, and what he's going to run into is a telling off because he's done the wrong thing. So it's striking how often weighty novels, so novels that are kind of part of what we all accept to be a kind of canon of literature, tell stories from the perspective of people, you know, like Huckleberry Finn, like Orlando, who are not necessarily high up in the hierarchy of credibility. And I'm stealing that phrase from Howard Becker, who's a sociologist, but the notion that in society there is a hierarchy of credibility, and it goes by groups. It's not an individual thing. You don't believe me because of who I am individually. You believe me today because I'm a professor who gets to stand up in front of you at the intellectual forum. But yeah, we have these hierarchies at work. And interesting that so many novels in the canon of literature choose to tell stories from the perspective of people who we would not listen to for 2 minutes if we met them on the street. And I think those unreliable storytellers, I mean, everyone who's studied literature or read a lot of books is really familiar with the notion of the unreliable storyteller. Huck is unreliable because he thinks it's okay to help an enslaved man escape. So these unreliable narrators, I think, are actually swinging the spotlight around onto me. So who's the unreliable person here? You know, is it actually this narrator, or is it me with all of these notions that I've ingested uncritically about how things ought to be? Is it actually the people at the top of the hierarchy of credibility? Is it actually the powerful people who tell us the truth? Really. Glory. The children in that story tell the adults about a huge, greedy crocodile that they've seen. Glory's, it's been compared with Animal Farm, so it's all animals in the story, all of the protagonists' animals. The children describe to the grown-ups a terrible crocodile they've seen. The adults don't believe them. The children say this crocodile is guzzling down the nation's resources, it's chewing up the political opposition. And the adults, of course, are completely wrong not to believe them, because the children are describing their government. And the adults don't see the truth until it's way too late, because they've believed the wrong people. So maybe we all need to think a bit more about who we believe. One of the questions that young tackles is what kinds of people are trustworthy Who do I believe? And white-haired men do remarkably well. No offence to anyone presently. White-haired men do very well at credibility states. You know, think Gandalf, think Obi-Wan Kenobi, think Gandhi. I'm not sure I trust Santa here, actually. But wisdom, kindliness, just leadership, all of these ideas go together with the notion of the white-haired man. And We That Are Young, Pretty Teenager tells the story of a white-haired old man who seems or maybe tries to look a bit like Gandhi. He's actually a billionaire CEO. He's greedy, he's corrupt, he very actively enjoys violence in his domestic life. And the general public finds him very believable. He's fighting his oldest daughter for control of the family business, and she doesn't stand a chance because her PR cannot beat his. You know, she's up against really ancient stories that were created to control her. She's up against stories like, you know, real women are modest and quiet and stay at home. And he can get up in public, and he does get up in public, and call her a bitch and a slut. And he can do that without hurting his public image as wise and kindly and paternal. So there's a whole history of ideas that's working in favour of people like him. I don't know if anyone's read We That Are Young. It does not have a happy ending. It probably has the scariest ending of any novel I've ever read. And in an interview, Pretty Teenager, the author, was asked, is there hope? And she said, yes, she thought so, because, and I'm quoting her, the forward action happens in the reader. And in fact, you know, it's not fictional characters in novels who decide what happens next in the world. It's readers who decide what happens next in the world. And when I finish reading a novel and nothing's changed in that novel's story world, that doesn't necessarily mean nothing's changed, because I might have thought about something I hadn't thought about before. I might have noticed something about the world I hadn't noticed before. I might have noticed something about myself I hadn't noticed before. Obviously, some novels do end optimistically. Saunders' novel, for example, they do show positive change in the story world. So in Lincoln, these ghosts, these characters in the bardo, work together for change and movement in the end. And in this novel, there are, and I didn't count this, I am geeky enough to do it, but it wasn't me on this occasion, there are 166 storytelling voices. And I must confess, the first time I read it, it drove me nuts. And I didn't carry on. And then fortunately, a friend said it was worth it and I should continue, and I did, and I'm really glad I did. But yeah, 166 different storytelling voices. And Lincoln deals, among other things, with a problem that is shaping contemporary politics, which is that not all storytelling is good storytelling. You know, I was saying that art and novels create movement in us. We're emotionally moved, we're cognitively moved. But some storytelling is not about movement. Some storytelling, I would say, is actively trying to prevent movement. And the ghosts in Lincoln, these ghosts that are stuck in the bardo. So the bardo in Buddhism is the space between life and death. And they have got stuck there because they're clinging to stories about their lives and will not let go of them. And holding on to those stories is keeping them stuck. They keep telling the same stories in the same words over and over again, justifying things they did in their lives up to and including sexual abuse and murder, and filtering out facts that disturb their self-justification, as we all do. And Saunders was writing this novel during the Trump campaign in 2016. And in interviews, one of the things he observed was that following that campaign on the Trump trail, he was writing about it for, I think, the New Yorker, he noticed that filtering out facts was one of the things that characterized the wealthy Republicans he met on the trail. He said people refuse to know things that make them feel bad. And he calls it, his expression for it, which is refusing to let the data come in. That was what he observed watching the more privileged of the Republicans on the trail, refusing to let the data come in. And he also then said that that refusal of data amounted to a shrinking or a reduction of the idea of America. So America got smaller because of people refusing to let the data come in. And some of his ghosts, I talked about literary bodies and how bodies appear in literature. Some of his ghosts in the Bardo manifest as literally shrunken. So they've refused so much data in their stories that they're mentally reduced, they're emotionally reduced, and they manifest then as physically reduced, as tiny, shrunken spirits who are also frozen. They're stuck in a concrete wall, they can't move anymore. So they've lost that capacity for movement. So if letting data come in makes us emotionally and cognitively mobile, refusing knowledge of other people's experience makes me smaller and stuck. And in Lincoln, the happy ending is that some of the ghosts, sorry, this is a spoiler, make a discovery that things do start moving when you're open to other people's experience. Which isn't to say that being open to other people's experience is necessarily comfortable. You know, how much can I bear to know about what's currently going on in Sudan, in Gaza, in Ukraine? You know, how much can I bear to know about how much of my comfortable lifestyle is propped up by modern slavery? Lincoln, interestingly, suggests that letting this data in can also be pleasurable. The ghosts have a capacity to literally access each other's experience. They can go inside each other's minds and be there. They call it intermingling. And they describe that as a very pleasurable experience. It leaves them feeling expanded, so feeling as if they've got bigger, and it gets them unstuck so that they're on the move again. And change happens when people are on the move. And good change happens maybe when that movement involves letting data come in. Change happens in glory when the characters use art specifically to share experience. They use songs and stories that travel across the country. So change travels in the defiant lullabies sung by mothers rocking famished babies, in the lyrics of dancehall artists, in the mics of spoken word poets spitting potent rhymes, in smoky bars all over the nation, in the bitter jokes of comedians making audiences laugh and weep, and in the words of writers. So change travels through storytelling, at which point we could say no wonder books get banned. And communities are built through storytelling. In Baruch-Lofgrad, we meet, it's a very funny novel, one of the very entertaining characters we meet is a really eccentric priest called Petya, and he's responsible for a community of farmers who've been made not only very poor but extremely fearful by the oligarchs who are coming through and stealing everything and heavily armed. He seems to be a Christian priest, but he doesn't seem to preach any particular version of Christianity. We hear that he just does things his own way. And towards the end of the novel, he sits down with a bunch of these bullied and intimidated farmers, and he tells them the story from the Old Testament of Daniel in the lion's den. But he tells his own version of the story. And in his version of the story, Daniel survives the lions by breathing fire. And he illustrates the story by breathing fire himself. He bends to tie his shoelace, and when he comes up again, he breathes a flame, a blue pink tongue of flame. Now, this priest has a slightly dodgy history, and he's learnt this trick, I think, in a circus we hear in some kind of previous life. But that effectively, so his tongue is on fire. And I think what we're also seeing is the flaming tongue of the storyteller, which is also a force of resistance. So a bit like Glory is a very, very funny novel. I mean, it is the funniest novel about genocide you'll read. It's astounding. I have no idea how she manages to be so funny about so extraordinarily serious matters. And the same is true for Jardin. It's really funny. And humour is a great form of resistance, as we saw in the lecture about protest art last week. And writers like Jardin and Bulawayo, and also Moyan, Life and Death is very funny, reveal the absurdity of authoritarianism. You know, it's easy to think of it as just frightening, but they show the absurdity of authoritarians and of the people who suck up to them. And I don't know who else has seen recent episodes of South Park. Yeah, I hear sniggers in the room, yes. You know, authoritarianism is scary and it's deeply silly at the same time. And art has some kind of capacity to capture that. And I'm happy to describe South Park as an art form. I can't help noticing that the Daniel story that the priest tells the farmers is a lie. Whatever you think about the truth status of the Bible story, the version where Daniel breathes fire is definitely a fib. And I did promise to talk about the difference between fiction and post-truth, so now might be a moment to do that. Again, stealing just initially from a colleague called Vittorio Buffacchi, who's a philosopher, post-truthers are different from liars. Liars accept that truth is a thing and take the decision not to tell it. Post-truthers do not actually recognise truth as a relevant category or as something that matters. And so, translating into this context, I think for post-truth, the only thing that matters is power, and the only function of words is to serve power. Whereas in fiction, for these novels, the function of words is to create meaning. So it's a very different understanding of what language is for. And in We the Too Young, the white-haired patriarch, the one who works hard to look a bit like Gandhi, uses a story, the story that women are dangerous, to discredit his daughter and get back control of his company. Now, I happen to think that that story is a lie. I'm reasonably convinced that some people who tell that story think that it's true, that women are dangerous. In this novel, those are not relevant categories because it is only about power. This white-haired old man, the CEO of the company, actually does not care whether that story is true or not. He's using words, he's using stories to hold on to power and not to make sense of the world. And obviously, the more absolute the power gets, the more grotesque post-truth is going to get. And Mo Yan shows us that in Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out. Has anybody else read this? It is great. You just need to keep a chart because it's generations of Chinese families, and you have to kind of record the patronymics and kind of work out who's related to who. And I genuinely had to kind of draw a genealogy of the families to be able to work out what's going on. But it's worth it. It's great. So Mo Yan drops us into 1960s China in the Cultural Revolution. And one of the scenes is a market parade. So these spectacles where people who've been disgraced were shamed in public. And on this particular scene, there's a man with a loudspeaker presenting a sacked communist official as a donkey rapist. And the man with the loudspeaker claims that this man conceived a child with a donkey. It's absurd. You know, it's very clearly not about truth. It's about power. And the crowd absolutely loves it. So I said, you know, we seem to love stories that nudge us to notice things about the world. But sadly, we also seem to love stories that diminish other people's humanity. And that then diminishes our own humanity. In Lincoln and the Bardo, that's what Saunders is showing us, that when we diminish other people's humanity, that makes us smaller people. And another problem, so many problems of contemporary politics, another problem of contemporary politics is clearly the problem of not letting the data come in. I mean, just looking quickly across, I mean, everyone's obsessed at the minute with the USA as if the rest of the world didn't exist. But nonetheless, you know, looking there at the elimination of official records of the experience of African American people, the elimination of official records of Native American people, of queer American people, it is a systematic attempt to shrink the idea of America, which is what Saunders seems to be almost predicting back before the first Trump presidency in Lincoln and the Bardo. And his shrunken spirits evade responsibility for the past by refusing to look back at it. They say time runs in only one direction. This is the spirit speaking. We're born along by it, influenced precisely as we are to do just the things that we do. And this one is a war criminal. How could I have done otherwise with time flowing in only one direction and myself made just as I was? So I just want to mention one more thing then that novels do resistantly, and that's time. Like Saunders' ghosts, we tend to think of time running in one direction, in a kind of straight line from a starting point to a finishing point, which makes some sense given that, you know, our own lives have starting points and finishing points. I can see where that thinking comes from. And nonetheless, novels don't normally tell stories in chronological straight lines. I mean, the classic one is the detective story where you start with the dead body, and then you spend the rest of the novel going backwards from there to try and work out why. And a writer who loves to mess creatively, or maybe resistantly with time, is Sharon Otu. A very interesting character, was born and educated in the UK, writes in German. So she moved to Berlin and lived there and then decided to start writing in German. As I said, she's spoken here, she was writing in residence for a while. She has a great sense of humour and has caused some upset among critics in Germany because she quite likes kind of poking fun at the Germans in her novels. She does it quite gently. But in Ada's realm, we start off with a boatload of Portuguese merchants heading up the coast of Africa in 1459. And every time these merchants drop anchor at an island, they declare that island discovered and they give it a name, as if time begins with their arrival there, which it clearly doesn't for the people who are already on the island. So Otto's doing a parody, I think, of a history of the world that starts when Europeans first discover things. It would be like a history of Cambridge that began in 1209 with the university and completely ignored the kind of centuries before that when the town of Cambridge already existed. And space-time in this novel, in Ada's realm, moves in loops rather than in lines. So we have 1459 West Africa, we have 1848 London, we have 1945 Germany, we have 2019 Berlin, but we don't visit them just in turn, we go back and forth between them, which means that as a reader, you find yourself looking at 6 centuries at the same time, which is quite mind-blowing. It's not the way that we're accustomed to looking at time from close up in our own lives. And seeing that kind of wide-angle view of time, that kind of huge range all at the same time, shows some things that maybe we don't see from close up. I mean, it shows resilience. This character, Ada, appears in each of the timelines, either as Ada or Ada or as Adama. She comes in different forms. And in each of the timelines, she's murdered and then she comes back again. So there's a kind of resilience there. In each of the timelines, she's murdered by a man who's called Guillerme or Wilhelm or William, who also keeps coming back. So it's not just good things that keep coming back. But the other thing we see over these 6 centuries is that there is actually no such thing as power that lasts forever. Colonial powers lose their colonies. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich managed 7 to 12 years, depending when you start counting. So that authoritarian fantasy of immortal power is a fantasy, and it's an absurd fantasy. In the kind of big time of this novel that we see, that simply doesn't happen. And that authoritarian love affair with immortality that we're seeing at the moment, I'm absolutely fascinated by all of these billionaire men who are wanting to be immortal. You know, who can possibly want to be immortal? And it's dangerous, but it's absurd. It is also absurd. And I'm just going to finish as the last thing I share with you is sharing one of my favourite moments in Glory, which is also one of my favourite novels. We're in a very oppressive regime. People are being disappeared. People are being murdered by the government. And as a mode of resistance, a wall is built called the Wall of the Dead. And the citizens come and they paint a red butterfly on the wall. That's what the butterflies are doing on the cover of the book. They paint a red butterfly on the wall for each of the people they knew or were related to who's been murdered or disappeared. And it becomes very popular. People flock to it and the government starts to get anxious. This has become a movement. You know, movement becomes a movement. And that movement leads the government to reveal its weakness and its absurdity in a really lovely moment. The seat of power, for the very first time in history, addressed the dead themselves in a statement broadcast all over the cemeteries and skies and airs the nation, and reminded them that when the seat of power that was above all seats of power invented the slogan, "Rest in peace," it meant for the dead to observe quietude and not become a living situation. It's a lovely moment, you know, the absurdity of the authoritarian will to avoid death, so to rule by creating fear of death, but then themselves to be absolutely terrified to look death in the face. So, winding up, I promised to ask and answer 3 questions in this lecture, and I just want to kind of do my duty and check in that I've done that. So, the first question I promised to answer was, is art a reason to hope when authoritarianism is looming? Well, in some ways over to you, but for me, I'd say it's a qualified yes. And it's a yes because art expresses, makes visible a human will to move and to be moved and to let the data come in. And that inevitably works against the people who want to restrict movement, who want to control data in the interests of having their power last forever. You know, if you want your power to last forever, you don't want anything to change. You don't want anyone to move. And art moves and it gets people on the move. That's a qualified yes, because I say that, you know, not just with sort of, you know, shiny hope in my eyes, but an awareness that authoritarians are extremely dangerous to artists. And, you know, bearing in mind that someone else who's spoken at the Intellectual Forum is Ai Weiwei, who has spent time in prison for his art. And, you know, the Artists Against the Kremlin, people who are spending time in prison for their art. And the PEN list, if you look up the PEN International page, you can see the very extensive list of writers in prison. And, you know, there are people, of course, who have also been executed. It isn't just prison. So, yes, hope, but hope with a not naive awareness that artists are very much at risk in these situations. The other question I promised to answer was what's the difference between post-truth and this kind of fiction that I've been talking about. You know, fiction's a lie too. So, you know, how's that different from post-truth? The difference, I think, is in the impetus and in the effect. So it's 2 differences. The impetus of post-truth, as I said, is always to serve power. There is no other interest in play except that. Where the impetus of fiction is to use language to create meaning, to do something which is communicative and meaningful. That's a really different impetus. And the effect is different too, because the effect of post-truth is to reduce possibility, to shrink possibility, to keep us in one place so that power can be maintained. You know, possibility is not something that authoritarians want to see happening. Do you want to intervene? Impetus drive. Yes, so what it's driving to do. Thank you for asking. So somebody asked what the meaning of impetus was. So the drive, the movement towards doing something. So that's the impetus, that's its intention, if you like. And then its effect of post-truth is to reduce or shrink possibility, to make us smaller. Whereas I think the effect of fiction, or at least of the kind of fiction I've been talking about, there are different kinds of fiction, is to expand possibilities. So it's not that uncommon to describe novels as a thought experiment, the what if. So, and the what if immediately opens out possibilities, what might be possible. And the last question I asked and said I would answer is, can a novel change anything? And that one matters to me because I work on them, and if they don't change anything, I've wasted a lot of years of my life. So I'm really confessing an interest here. But actually, yes, I think a novel can change something. I don't think that if we look back over literary history, it would be easy to pinpoint a novel that's changed the world, at least not for the better. I can think of a couple that have done some damage, but not for the better. But a novel can change something in you. It can change what you notice about the world, and what you do with that is then down to you. And thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to take some questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Sarah. That was expectedly wonderful. And novels can change the world. Brilliant talks can change the world. So absolutely fantastic. We have time for questions either online, so please use the Q&A thing, or raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Anybody like to start us off?
And you're welcome just to kind of share experiences of novels as well if you want. You don't have to ask questions. I'm also interested in what you've been reading. There's a microphone on its way to you.
Well, my experience with this kind of novels date back like 5 decades ago when I was a teenager, and I was advised to read Animal Farm and 1984, Huxley,
Brave New World, yeah.
revisited as well, and so on. So that's really shook me. My version of reality up to then was fairly stable and fairly naive. And then fast forward all these years ago, I read on a Blue Sky post by Margaret Atwood that she's been involved in pen for many, many decades. That musing about a book being banned in Alberta recently, and the meaning of that. So, I was thinking all these decades ago, when I started thinking about these things and questioning power and authority, and then things seem to gradually get worse. If I look, on all the authoritarian moves made globally now, and is it impossible to ignore what happened in the States, also in the UK, in Europe, and so on and so forth. So, I'm at loss what to say to the younger generation who question this or even don't want to engage with this. It's like, it's not my problem, carry on with my life and things will unravel, So, just for to say.
Yeah, my awesome experience for the younger generation, you very much do want to engage with it, fortunately. But yeah, thank you. That was very interesting.
So there's a question at the back there. Can you just wait for the microphone to get to you?
Hello. I have a question for you. What was the most meaningful message that you've read from a novel or a book that really shook you into reality? And being like, wow, this is something that actually happens in the world. Like I wasn't it's told in stories, but it's not everybody's always aware of things that are in real life happening books. So what was the most meaningful message for you?
That's a really interesting question. Various things spring to mind, from quite kind of small and specific things to much bigger things. So, for example, reading We the Too Young, I found out for the first time how cashmere is made. And I had not realised how extremely problematic the production and cruel the production of cashmere is. So that was a shock. But more general things, on the bad side, the way that power is not necessarily a bad thing. Oppressive power, the kind of power that wants to prevent movement, keeps rising in the world. That every time it seems to be defeated, it re-emerges. And almost all of these novels touch on that one way or another. On the good side, a kind of shock of hope, I would say, was this novel, Glory. Maybe I should go on one just so that we see all of the novels again. Sorry, did you already turn that off? There we go. Because Glory shows what happens when people start to act together. And it's not a simple process. So the first time people act together, they're brutally beaten down. But they come back and do it again. And I don't want to say more than that, but there was something really moving in a sense of hope, actually, in reading Glory, and that showing of, yes, acting together can result in more brutal oppression, but it can also result in change. Do you have an experience of something that changed for you reading a novel? I just wondered if that question came from somewhere.
Oh, because I read a lot. So there was the first book that I've ever read, like a serious one, The Girl in Pieces. It's about a teenage girl, and then she goes off in her 20s, but she was in a psych ward. So that really just struck something in me. I was like 12 when I read this.
Right.
So I wasn't very aware about mental illnesses and
Yeah.
how like the brain really works. And
Yes.
after reading that, I just kind of had a flick switch in my brain being like, oh, this is actually real life.
Okay.
People really go through this. And like other life things that she went through, I was like, wow, this is real. Like this could happen to me, this could happen to my friend. And I just wanted to know if you had.
That's really interesting. Actually, a lot of people have that, a memory of the novel that first really shifted something for them. So yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
Of course, thank you.
Can I bring in a couple of questions from online, if that's all right? Sorry, and then and Pablo, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature. So firstly, one that's not a question from somebody who said, I want to just say this was brilliant. I generally avoid dystopians because of how confronting they are. They knock down the pillars of safety in my mind that I am okay. They leave me exposed and scared. But I'm learning from you that fear isn't something to run from. It's when you sit with those feelings, as you said, that stirs movement.
Oh, brilliant observation. Thank you.
So, and then there's another question from Thomas Tam, who says, on your mention of fiction that can change the world and not necessarily for the better, I was thinking of Starship Trooper by Robert A. Heinlein. A lot of people have described the novel as an ode to fascism and a more authoritarian style of system, expecting the world to be better for it. Would you say that the novel in many ways has a lot of parallels with post-truth society, given the fictional setting? And is it because of society is following that where truth is born out of violence? I don't know if you know that book.
I don't know the book, which might make it difficult for me to answer the question. So I certainly agree that there are, I mean, the ones that spring to mind for me are Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, which is the Bible of many of the current kind of videos. Yeah, but no, thank you for that. I'm actually going to go away and look at that novel. It sounds like something I won't enjoy reading, but it sounds important.
There's a film which largely makes fun of it, but not always understood. Here we go.
Thank you. I was wondering why you think that humor is such a useful tool in these contexts. Obviously, it's a very serious thing. And then what is it about humor that lets you access these things?
That's a really important question. Obviously, humour is a difficult one because there are, I always think we should have different names for different kinds of humour because there are two very distinct kinds of humour. And one kind of humour reinforces the rules and makes fun of people who go against them. And that's a very disciplinary kind of humour. And that's not the kind of humour I'm talking about, because the kind of humour I'm talking about, as I say, I think we ought to have a different word for it, is the subversive kind of humour. And I think it's important. I can't remember his name. Mark Chadbourne. I read a very good essay on this, explaining that in the current context, people who are attracted by the right and by the oppressive right are attracted by the drama and the danger rather than necessarily by specific content. And to turn that into humour makes it seem much less attractive. I mean, if you go back in, looking around for Lizzie, it's Schiller. So go back in sort of German history to Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, who was a dramatist who never managed to write a comedy in his whole entire life. But he thought comedy was the most important kind of theatre because it made people want to not be like that. Nobody actually wants to be laughed at. Nobody wants to appear absurd. And so in making certain kinds of behaviour appear absurd, that's a really powerful weapon. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Alexander Gubsky was talking last week about Good Soldier Schweik,
Yes.
Which is a sort of ultimate absurdist, anti-war piece. A few more questions coming in here online, but should we go to another one in the room? There's one right at the back. Yeah. If you ask the questions, we can maybe have more.
Sorry. You said that some books change the world for the worst, and then you gave the example of Ayn Rand, but I was just wondering which other books, and then following on that, thinking about freedom of speech, what do you see as a solution to those books? Do you think they should always be read accompanied by an explanation why they're not examples that should be followed? Because then we might follow into the same narrative of some books should be banned, right? But that's not the narrative that we want to stick to.
Yeah, I mean, changing the world for the worst is something people do, and one doesn't ban them for doing it. So yes, Ayn Rand I was thinking of. What else was I thinking? I mean, there's a German novel that became a film called Jude Zeus, which was a very influential Nazi story about Jewishness. I'm even starting to get suspicious of Lord of the Rings because it seems to be inspiring a certain way of thinking in a certain kind of people. I mean, people bring things to novels. You know, maybe one shouldn't just blame the novels themselves. People bring baggage with them. On the freedom of speech question, one has to let the data come in. And if the data is data I don't like, you know, it's still data. I genuinely do want to read that Heinlein novel that somebody online recommended, even though I'm pretty sure I won't like it, because that's important information. If I won't listen to what the other side are saying, and the other side mean it seriously too, you know, I think it's a real mistake to think that anyone else is either a monster or an idiot. They are neither of those things. And you know, they're also looking at me sometimes and wondering if I'm a monster or an idiot. You know, one has to let the data come in. I think George Saunders gets it.
So there's another question at the back, and then we'll come to one at the front here.
Sorry, I just had a quick question about the Lincoln and the Bardo. You were mentioning the ghosts who committed really horrible crimes, such as abuse, and you were saying how they were stuck.
Yes.
And then some of the ghosts could move forward because they could realise what they did. Do you ever think that maybe the ghosts who committed the really horrible crimes, such as like child abuse, do you think that those ghosts didn't move forward because they didn't deserve to leave the Bardo and accept death? Or is it just because you think of just because of what kind of people they are that they can't bring themselves to do that? Or is it even if they could, they wouldn't get the chance that the other ghosts did because they didn't deserve it in some sense?
Well, certainly George Saunders doesn't seem to think that they deserve to leave the Bardo, because those ghosts in the Bardo, so we're in America, you know, during segregation, and the cemetery is segregated. There's a white part of the cemetery and there's a black part of the cemetery, and there's a wall in between in which these shrunken ghosts are kind of embedded as bits of the wall. And again, this is a bit of a spoiler, but they don't get to move on. So, you know, in answer to your question from George Saunders' perspective, I would say Saunders doesn't appear to think that they deserve to move on. Does that answer all right? Yeah. What do I think? I think I cannot answer that question because it goes way beyond my competence to say what. No, it's just it seems to turn me into a sort of God figure if I get to decide which groups of human beings deserve salvation. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to duck it because I just don't feel I can say.
I can think of worse gods, but we have a Sarah at the front here.
Hey, thank you. That was really good. I can't wait to read your book as a PDF next week. I guess my question is just about how you account for the variety of responses that we all might have to these texts, and what that means for what a book can do. Sorry, what a book like can do rather than does, essentially or necessarily. And what that might mean for the possibilities of, or the potentialities of literary writing.
The thing is, a book can also do nothing if I don't want it to. So, you know, if I choose to finish a book and think that was nice and then never think about it again, maybe the book has done nothing. I think all I can ever talk about, you know, I'll say we, because I know you've worked in literature as well, all we can ever talk about is what the potentialities are, what possibilities are opened up. And then, you know, as I said at the end, what I then do with that is down to me. And if I want to do nothing with it, I'll do nothing with it. And there's nothing a writer can do about that. I don't know how that feels for writers. I don't know if you've ever asked a writer that question. What does it feel like when people read your books and do nothing? Yeah.
Pablo Chopin online says,
Oh, happy to hear from
thank you for the wonderful presentation. Greetings from Kiev. Is the idea that literature and art in general do not change anything or matter for society, not some kind of doubt or down-to-earth empiricism, but in itself a kind of post-truth, an active stance against moving people towards expanding their possibilities, not indifference, but an active authoritarian stance?
Yes, I'm sure you're right. I think that's a great way of pushing it. That yes, it's a will for them to do nothing. It's a will for them to avoid movement. Yes, thank you.
We'll have a question right at the front here.
Thank you. I was interested you mentioned Huckleberry Finn. Having recently read James, my personal favourite, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on his removal of Huck's point of view, pushed on Jim's point of view throughout the novel, and how much impact that had. And a related question is, if a writer is deliberately trying to build up resistance and make a movement, is that a challenge to reader? It puts a lot of people off.
So the first, keep the microphone, because I need you to answer the first question, because I haven't read that novel.
Oh, well,
So tell us what does happen. What effect does it have?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it. The narrative stays very much the same for a half, 2/3. The end changes drastically and dramatically, and I think in a very positive way.
Yeah.
In terms of the other question, do you get the impression, personal evidence, all of his writing is deliberately, pushing a point very strongly,
Right.
whereas some writers, of perhaps Richard Flanagan in question 7, is basically saying the important thing is to ask the question,
Yes.
not to provide the answer.
And Jane Austen doesn't really feel like she's out on a charger, when leading the charge when she writes, and nonetheless there's a lot going on. So I guess it is to some extent a matter of personal taste whether one enjoys a novel that has a more overt project or not. But I think my point is that even when we look back at the novels that we think of as being part of that sort of elite power-driven canon of literary history, even those novels are actually doing something quite resistant, and I find that really interesting.
So the questions are in the middle of this block.
Hi,
Okay.
thank you very much for the talk. It was very engaging. I just wanted to ask you, I'm sure you're aware that there has been a shift in the last couple of years in schools for children choosing to do STEM subjects rather than English literature and the humanities. And I'm wondering whether you think that these books or books like these should be implemented in GCSE level, and if that was the case, how would we encourage these kids who are just 15, 16 to engage with them and look at the world around them? We did 1984 to GCSE, I remember. I really enjoyed it, but a lot of my classmates, they were very bored by it, and we weren't really taught any historical context surrounding that novel and of its importance beyond just the words in the novel itself.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. So I know we have experts in the room on the question of teaching literature in schools. So please correct me. I mean, my sense is that teachers are actually quite limited in what they can teach because the curriculum is quite limiting. Is that, sorry, to look at Rachel and the St. Bede's contingent. Would you mind putting the microphone over there so that they can give an answer to what it's like on the front line? Because I think it's actually important, rather than me saying this, the people who are on the front line of teaching literature at schools, what do you think should happen and what's it like at the minute?
Well, I'm not.
No, you're a librarian, Rachel.
Yeah.
I know.
Well, I would think that I'm an English teacher, so I would suggest that these sort of books are in the library and they're accessible to young people, not necessarily to be taught on the curriculum in which we're looking at development skills and accessing them, but engaging them within the library, taking them to the library and library lessons. It's not something that all schools do to actually encourage that within the curriculum. but so I'm Rachel is an excellent librarian who will speak about it.
Well, I was going to thank you. Your talk was so inspiring, and I've been looking at censorship and book bans and have done displays in the library to try to draw attention to young people and how important and how lucky they are have access to these books that lots of people don't. And yeah, I feel it's really important. But I just actually, can I sneak in a question? I was going to ask you if you could prescribe one book to young children of secondary age, what would it be that you feel is so important that they should?
Wow, what a question. So not that young children, if it's secondary age, we're talking sort of.
I mean,
yeah,
okay. I mean, you young or it's only that I'm interested in. So.
No, I mean, you're pushing me on the spot in a really important way, because one of the things that we're supposed to be doing in this big project I introduced at the beginning is thinking about school curricula. And so I just looked rather helplessly at Tara, my narrator, over there. If I was choosing, I don't know, there are so many amazing novels out there. I mean, I passed on to your school library Ada's Realm and Glory, which I think they're both suitable for that age group, and they're both amazing novels. Would those be the two of all I would choose? I mean, maybe at the moment, but maybe if you asked me again in 2 years, I'd change my mind. What would you choose? I mean, you're a librarian. Yeah, you see what it's like.
If I remember correctly, Ada's Realm was actually set on a German exam paper a couple of years ago, I think Sharon was saying.
Yes, it's always set on
No, in Germany. I think it was a school exam text.
Very cool.
So there's a couple of questions I'd like to bring in from online as well, and we'll try and fit in some more there. So one is from Poznan in Poland, from Tomasz Mierzakiewicz. Do you know everybody who's here? Says, Marta Minin used banned books to make art objects after the fall of the Argentinian junta, the Parthenon of books. Do you agree that banned books in her installation present the free use of books in the constant reinstallation of democracy, using the energy of free movement caused by these books to use novels in a constant reshaping of democratic institutions and practices? So it's like combining novels with sculpture here.
I think that was put so beautifully. I couldn't put it better. Yes.
So, yes, fantastic. that was nice and fast. And I think let's go now. There was a couple of questions. There's one. Let's go right at the back there.
Thank you very much. I did earlier a small test with my seat neighbor and compared Google researches on our phones, and we found out that we got quite different results for the same question. And I was also thinking of the story where the ghost just needed to be open to data or information and then move on in their life. But then today I feel like the information we get is so different, and also sometimes things are flooded with information and it's very difficult to navigate and orientate. And it's not just being open and moving on. So I was wondering how it was for you, maybe also going through all these stories, learning to pick good novels, picking, kind of developing these skills, and what you think is important for other people that might not have these skills to choose good novels.
Yeah. Okay, that's very good. And you picked me up on something I was being imprecise about. So George Saunders in those interviews is also talking about social media and the problem of the flood of data, and that isn't what he means by letting the data come in. When one would have to, so there are two interviews he gave to Foyle's Bookshop, and they're about 20 minutes each, and one can listen to them. But letting the data come in is distinct from social media, and it means he's describing the habit of the novelist in everyday life, which is to go out into the world and pay attention to what's happening for other people. That's what he means by letting the data come in. So I'm sorry, I think I didn't make that very clear. On the other question, the way I selected these novels was by choosing or taking books that other people had given me. Because there was no way I could be systematic. You know, I haven't read all the novels in the world, so I couldn't begin to claim that I had some kind of method for choosing them. So I picked 8 that people had given me, or yeah, basically the people had given me, and then trusted the people who know me. So I don't know if, you know, maybe we all need to pass novels around more. I certainly have friends I exchange novels with, and I find it a very meaningful element in a friendship to know someone you exchange books with.
We're beginning to run out of time. I know there are some other questions in person and online. So perhaps if we can have brief questions and brief answers. Just one from Charlene, who talks about, I personally see horror as the most confronting genre. It untangles me in a really uncomfortable way and can take me months to feel like myself again. What's your opinion on horror as a resistant genre? And do you have any horror novel recommendations? You may want to focus on the first part of the question.
All I can say is that, Charlene, you are a braver woman than I am. I don't read horror because I can't cope, which means I have no recommendations. I'm very sorry.
So, you know, clearly quite a powerful genre, but difficult. There's a question over there. That might be the last one.
Hello. I want to say thank you for your talk today, and I think it was really interesting. It was really wonderful, and there's something I wanted to share. I think many people are aware of what is going on in Russia right now, and people really look at what they are able to listen and what songs they can sing and what books they can publish. And there are also like quite recently there was arrested a young lady who was singing a song about the war on the street. She is like 18 years old, and I'm finding it's really I think horrible how and silly at the same time how authority can stay can be really powerful, but at the same time it's being really weak, and how powerful can art and singers can be, even if we are not, if we think that the writers or singers or other artists are not important, but it's actually really important as how weak the government can be if they face like even really small positions.
If an 18-year-old girl singing a song is so frightening, I know, and it's appalling from her perspective, and as you say, yes, it's also pathetic.
I also wanted to ask the question why the power decided to not move on, and why after a survey they decided to keep being and decided to limit other people.
Why people in power don't want to give it up? Yeah. So we could talk for ages about this. I suspect it has something to do with fear of death. I think the people who cling most desperately to power are the people who are most terrified of the notion of the end of their own lives. But that's a big question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that may be where we have to end things. We could go on for a very long time, but Sarah, that's been absolutely amazing. Thank you very much for everything you've shared with us. All the response. So that's it for now, but we have a lot more coming up. In a couple of weeks, we have a professional actor and headhunter talking about acting up and how you can use the power of your presence. Then we're looking the week after that about Unveiled, Inside Iran's Women Life Freedom Revolt, another protest-related topic. And then we have one of our vets talking about growing healthier adult bodies and lessons from rainforest communities. There is much, much more to come along. So please do come along tonight. You know, it's been wonderful to have you here tonight, in person or online. And Sarah, again, you have been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.